So at this point in the module, you all have read 3 ethically constitutive stories that deal with the foundational narrative of Rome, mostly during the Roman Republican times. You also have viewed a brief timeline that had got you up to the point where we have the Roman Republic, from, of course, Greek colonialism to the Greek and Etruscan synthesis that eventually led to the foundation of Rome. And one of the ethically constitutive stories you guys have already looked at was the story of Romulus and Remus. And while I don't want to spend a lot of time giving you a synopsis of the story as you've already read it, what we see there is certain values that would be attributed to the establishment of Rome. First and foremost, the idea of conflict, that Romulus, of course, was forced to slay his brother Remus over disagreement over the foundational story. Also, another important aspect, if we're building an ethically constitutive narrative and trying to build citizenship within a growing empire, we want to give people a reason as to why they are subscribing to this new state, this forming state, and nature would be a great reason. These 2 orphans raised by wolves almost leads the listener / reader, depending on how people were receiving this message, that Rome is a natural part of nature and thus human trajectory. As we move forward, though, the most important ethically constitutive story in dealing with the formation of the general Roman Republic is the rape of Lucrece. Now, before I get into the actual story and how it founds the idea of the Roman Republic, I have the word general written up here, and I must make a quick note that the Republic existed in one form or another for about 5 centuries. So for me to insinuate that the general Roman Republic, as I'm about to diagram up here, stayed that way and was always that way for 5 centuries would be absolutely incorrect. Over 5 centuries, different positions garnered more power, sometimes new positions were created. All I'm trying to present is a general framework for us to understand what Roman republicanism looked like in its ideological construction. So let's get back to the rape of Lucrece real fast. Again, I'm not going to give you the entire synopsis. You've already read that. But long story short, when the Etruscan princess Lucrece is raped, and instantly her husband and her father seek her vengeance and succeed in getting her revenge, they decide that they need to manufacture a new way of being to challenge the old hierarchies that existed, that they argued led to this insidious act by the Etruscan prince that ended up raping Lucrece. He saw it as a position of power, and that it was his right, more or less, to do so. So, again, whether or not this actually occurred is not the debate. The debate is that this story helps found the idea that Republican Rome will create a more just and more equitable society. Now, as far as what that society ends up looking like, we have a very basic construction here. And it took time. It definitely took time to construct the society. But at the top of what Rome was able to create was a position, were a position called the consuls. Now, the consuls were essentially elected officials serving in, if I were to use a modern term, which probably shouldn't, but we will anyway, served a somewhat executive function in this Roman Republic. These consuls often shared power with a much more common word we're all used to hearing, the Senate. The Senate originally began as a group of elders that served in an advisory role, but over those 5 centuries, eventually they began to serve a legislative function, not unlike, of course, modern senates today. Another important position, if we think about it, in the Roman Republic were the roles of praetors. You're going to have to excuse my Latin. The praetors essentially served 2 roles. Their primary function was to sub in for the consuls if the consuls were ever not able to serve. The second function for the praetors, and arguably maybe even more important than serving as substitute consuls, is they were the new territory governors of all conquered territory. So essentially, as Rome was expanding, which of course empires do, and you got to see a little bit of that in the readings, it was the praetor's job to go to these new territories and essentially Romanize the population. This took place in regions like Greece or in Judea, or after, of course, Carthage in North Africa. So the praetors essentially had the function of spreading the narratives and thus the ideology of Republican Rome. So they served a very crucial function. Also important to note in this Roman Republic is this other group of people called quaestors. And what these quaestors were meant to do is they also had dual functions. They served as the state treasurers. They also served quite often as the state prosecutors. And you might imagine there was sometimes a conflict of interest in prosecution and, of course, trying to generate wealth for the Roman treasury, which we'll get into in just a moment. Another important position within the Roman Republic was the role of censors. Now, censors didn't necessarily serve the same function as modern censors do regarding media, but there are some similarities. The censor's job, essentially, to put it in, again, modern terms, is they were the layers of bureaucrats that dictated quite often what was Roman, what was not Roman, and how to, of course, better utilize the ideologies and narratives of the Roman Republic in social life. Eventually, later on, and I'm going to put it up here now, even though we're not going to talk about it just yet, there was another body formed called the Concilium Plebis, which is basically the council of the plebeians, which does lead me to my next point. Built into the Roman Republic, even with its promise of more equity and more representation, was class conflict. Now, while there were many different classes, different pieces of labor that were necessary to make Rome function, the two most primary, to simplify matters here, were the patrician class and the plebeian class. And we can think of the patricians as somewhat like an aristocracy. Every position on here except the concilium plebis was manned by patricians, and I do use the word man intentionally. This was, of course, a patriarchal society, which meant as Rome began to expand and progress and more ideas began to circulate within the Republic, plebeians, these lower classes, these laborers, not slaves, mind you, began to have certain questions about the inequity of decision-making, the inequity of material resources, and it is through a series of wars and conflicts and uprising and rebellions that they eventually, in the 3rd century BCE, were awarded the Concilium Plebis as a lower-tier governing body over the Roman Republic. This struggling conflict is often called the struggle of the orders, and it was between the patricians and the plebeians. Violence, boycotts, all led to certain rights being given in something called the Licinian Sextian rogations. And officially, a piece of legislation known as the Lex Hortensia was recognized in 287 BCE, giving the plebeians the right to be represented in the Concilium Plebis. This is also important. This basic struggle of the orders between, of course, the patricians and the plebeians didn't just end with the recognition of the Concilium Plebis. It carried on through the 3rd, into the 2nd, into the 1st century, and it eventually spilled over into issues regarding land use, especially the land use of veterans. So it's no surprise to anyone that empires are built on constant warfare and conflict, and that requires armies. Well, the Roman legions and the rest of the Roman military were made up highly of people that would have been from the plebeian class and maybe even lower. What they did get was land. However, since they were consistently gone fighting, that land would go fallow while they were gone. So there were times, especially in the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st century BCE, that the Roman patricians serving in Rome proper would auction off this land so as to be able to use it and thus feed the empire. And when veterans would come home, they would find themselves without land. Now, needless to say, when this land was auctioned off, oftentimes the only people that could afford to bid on it were the patricians themselves. So larger and larger estates began to spring up throughout the Italian peninsula, and then later on to other places throughout the Mediterranean where Rome had conquered. These large plantations are known as latifundia. And it is these latifundia that many veterans came into conflict with. They thought, of course, after serving Rome bravely, buying into the narratives, right, that as veterans, they should, of course, have their lands given back to them. Oftentimes that did not take place, and it's at this moment in time, especially in the first century, that we see the struggle of orders become more and more violent. With the rise of certain generals or leaders within the Roman military, leading their own client armies against the state to fight for veterans' rights. Some of these Roman leaders, some of these Roman military leaders that guided these client armies were Marius, the Gracchus brothers, Sulla, Pompey, and eventually even Julius, who we all know eventually becomes Caesar. And that's important to note. It is through these client armies we see a transition in Rome, again, especially in the 1st century BCE, and that transition leads to eventually the formation of triumvirates. And it's at this point we'll pick up with the rise of the cult of the emperor.